Friedrich Nietzsche was a famous philosopher who asked big questions about life, truth, and what it means to be human. His ideas can make us think deeply, but today we'll explore them slowly and peacefully. Let your mind relax as we journey into his thoughts, helping you find calm and quiet before sleep. There are thinkers whose ideas feel like gentle ripples on the surface of history. And then there are thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche, whose words strike like lightning, setting entire landscapes ablaze. More than a century after his death, his sentences still pulse with danger in life, as if written not for the 19th century, but for this very moment. In an age of constant noise, Nietzsche remains unsettlingly silent. No institutional dogma, no academic jargon, no political banner can contain him. His philosophy resists reduction. It lives, fierce, unpredictable, alive with contradictions. To read Nietzsche is to confront a mirror that both flatters and terrifies. He was, above all, a philosopher who refused comfort. At a time when Europe believed in progress, in science, in God's order, Nietzsche whispered the words that shattered the illusion. God is dead. For many, it was blasphemy. For Nietzsche, it was diagnosis. Something had already died, long before anyone dared to admit it. The modern world had killed its own faith, not with malice, but with enlightenment, with reason, with curiosity. Humanity had dissected its gods, questioned its scriptures, and found in their place silence. Nietzsche's cry was not a celebration, but an alarm. If God was gone, who or what would take his place? What would guide humanity now that heaven had gone dark? The question still burns. Across universities and YouTube comment sections alike, his name surfaces with fascination and fear. Nietzsche seems to hover between prophet and heretic, genius and madman. His words are quoted by artists, misused by ideologues, and misunderstood by almost everyone. Yet his shadow remains, stretching from philosophy to psychology, from literature to politics, from existentialism to memes. Why does Nietzsche still blow minds today? Because he speaks to the void that modernity opened, the aching space where certainty once lived. When Nietzsche declared that God was dead, he wasn't talking about theology. He was describing a cultural earthquake, the collapse of all absolute meaning. Morality, truth, progress, all the grand pillars of civilization were, he believed, human constructions. And now the scaffolding was collapsing. Humanity stood before the abyss, stripped of its comforting fictions. Most thinkers would have despaired. Nietzsche smiled. For him, the death of God was not the end, but the beginning. It was a chance, terrifying, yet liberating, to create new values, to invent meaning rather than inherit it. The old world had given us commandments. Nietzsche challenged us to become creators. He called this the path of the Bormensch, the overman, the one who transcends the herd and shapes his own destiny. This idea has been misread countless times. The Bormensch is never a conqueror in the political sense, nor a symbol of dominance over others. It was a metaphor for spiritual strength, for the rare individual who can affirm life fully, even its pain, without retreating into illusions. And yet, Nietzsche knew how fragile that strength was. Most people, he thought, were not ready for freedom. They would rather remain comfortable, entertained, and safe, what he later called the last men, small, content, and empty. To live as the Bormensch meant embracing risk, creation, and chaos. It meant becoming a work of art, forged by one's own will. Nietzsche's entire philosophy, from Thus Spoke Zarathustra to Beyond Good and Evil, circles this question. What happens when we lose the gods and must become creators ourselves? Few philosophers have dared to speak so directly to life itself. Nietzsche's prose is not systematic. It's musical, poetic, eruptive. He wrote not to build a theory, but to awaken the reader. His sentences burn like fragments of prophecy. Become who you are. What does not kill me makes me stronger. He who fights with monsters should see to it that he himself does not become a monster. Each line feels like a challenge. Each idea forces confrontation. But Nietzsche's greatness lies not only in his provocations, but in his psychological depth. Long before Freud or Jung, he saw the human soul as a battlefield of instincts, noble and base, creative and destructive. He called this struggle the will to power, the fundamental drive that animates all life, not merely to survive, but to expand, to express, to overcome. For Nietzsche, life itself was a form of art. To live was to shape oneself as an artist shapes a sculpture, to carve strength out of suffering, to turn chaos into form. And yet, Nietzsche's own life was anything but serene. Behind the blazing intellect was a man constantly at war, with his body, with his society, with his own mind. His brilliance came at the cost of isolation. He was often sick, misunderstood, and alone. By the time the world began to recognize his genius, he had already fallen into madness. But perhaps that is why his ideas still strike so hard today. Nietzsche does not speak from a podium of success, but from the edge of collapse. His insights are not comfortable truths. They are forged in anguish. In an era of moral confusion, social media outrage, and constant identity crises, Nietzsche's words return like an echo from another century. He saw what happens when people lose their sense of higher purpose, when they trade greatness for comfort, when truth becomes a matter of opinion. He saw our future. Everything is subject to interpretation, he wrote. Whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power, not truth. Today, in a world where information multiplies and certainty dissolves, Nietzsche's warning feels prophetic. He understood that when truth dies, the struggle for meaning becomes a struggle for dominance. But Nietzsche was no nihilist, despite the label often attached to him. Nihilism, for him, was a sickness. The sickness of those who recognize that values are human creations, but cannot bear the weight of that freedom. They sink into despair, believing that life is meaningless. Nietzsche wanted to cure that despair, not surrender to it. His cure was courage, the courage to affirm life without justification, to say yes to existence, even when it offers no guarantees. He called this amor fati, the love of fate, the art of embracing everything that happens, the beautiful and the terrible alike, as necessary and good. It was not optimism, but defiance. Nietzsche's heroes are not saints or martyrs. They are dancers, creators, and warriors of the spirit. They face the abyss and laugh. They turn suffering into strength, solitude into freedom, and destruction into creation. In this sense, Nietzsche was not merely a philosopher. He was a psychologist of the future, a poet of power, a prophet of self-overcoming. His ideas do not invite agreement. They demand response. One cannot read Nietzsche and remain neutral. He infects the reader with questions that will not go away. What if your deepest beliefs were illusions? What if morality itself was a cage? What if everything you've been taught to avoid, pride, ambition, struggle, was in fact the source of vitality? Nietzsche wanted humanity to become a new kind of being, one that could create its own values instead of borrowing them from gods or traditions. He did not give answers. He gave fire. And perhaps that is why he still fascinates us. In a world that promises comfort and safety, Nietzsche speaks of danger and greatness. In a culture obsessed with validation, he demands self-mastery. Where others offer peace of mind, he offers the storm. To read him is to awaken the part of oneself that refuses mediocrity, that senses, beneath the surface of ordinary life, a deeper call. To overcome, to create, to affirm. Nietzsche's thought is not easy. It is not meant to be. It is a mirror that reflects our weakness and our strength, our despair and our potential. It asks relentlessly, are you willing to become who you are? That question haunted him until the end. It still haunts us now. For Nietzsche, philosophy was not a profession. It was a battle against complacency, against falsehood, against the decay of spirit. To think was to fight, to live was to risk. And in that risk, he found truth. More than a century later, his ideas still unsettle because they strike at the foundations of comfort. They remind us that freedom is not given, but earned. That meaning is not found, but made. That life, in all its chaos and cruelty, is the raw material for greatness. Nietzsche's voice, fierce and fragile, continues to echo through time. It whispers to artists and rebels, to dreamers and outcasts, to anyone who senses that there is more to life than obedience. His philosophy remains dangerous precisely because it is alive, because it refuses to die, because it keeps demanding more of us. And so, the journey into Nietzsche's world begins not with peace, but with provocation. His words are not a destination, but a doorway, one that leads into the labyrinth of his life, his pain, and his genius. To understand why Nietzsche thought as he did, we must follow him. From his youth in a quiet German town, through his meteoric rise as a scholar, to his lonely years of exile and collapse. Behind every line of fire he wrote, there was a story of a man who sought truth so fiercely that it broke him. That story begins in 1844, in a small village called Racken, where a boy was born to a pastoress family, a boy who would one day declare that God was dead. In the autumn of 1844, in the small Saxon village of Racken, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born under the quiet shadow of a church steeple. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran pastor, proud, devout, and gentle. His mother, Franziska, kept the household with strict piety and strength. In their modest parsonage, faith was not an idea, but the air itself. Morning prayers, hymns at supper, and the ever-present sense that life was a gift from God. From his earliest years, Nietzsche absorbed this atmosphere of reverence. He was a solemn child, introspective, intense, and unusually sensitive. While other boys played outside, he would sit alone, lost in thought, listening to the sound of the church bells. His father saw in him a spark of something rare and nurtured it with pride, but that light dimmed early. When Nietzsche was only 5, his father suffered a mysterious brain illness that left him blind and delirious. Within a year, he was dead. A few months later, Nietzsche's younger brother also died. The house that had once echoed with sermons and laughter became quiet with grief. For the rest of his life, Nietzsche would carry the image of his father as slow decline, a pious man undone by madness, a devout soul swallowed by darkness. It was the first fracture in his faith. If God was good, how could such a thing happen? After his father's death, Nietzsche, his mother, sister, and grandmother moved to Naumburg, a provincial town by the Saal River. There he grew into a boy of precocious intellect and delicate health. Teachers noticed his discipline and seriousness. At school, he excelled in Latin and Greek, memorizing verses from Homer and composing his own poems. His classmates nicknamed him the Little Pastor for his piety and reserve. Yet even as a child, he harbored doubts that he dared not speak aloud. The sermons that once comforted him began to sound hollow. The hymns that once lifted him began to echo strangely. Somewhere between childhood and adolescence, a new voice began to whisper, skeptical, searching, restless. At 14, Nietzsche earned a scholarship to Schulpforte, one of Germany's most rigorous boarding schools. There, amid stone walls and cloistered gardens, he immersed himself in the classical world, in Homer's heroes, Aeschylus's tragedies, and the thunderous questions of Greek philosophy. He was captivated by the grandeur and cruelty of ancient life, so unlike the moral gentleness of his Christian upbringing. For Nietzsche, the Greeks were not moralists but realists. They faced suffering without disguise, transforming pain into art. Their gods were not all good. They were powerful, beautiful, and flawed, reflections of life itself. From them, Nietzsche learned his first great lesson, that truth and beauty often dwell in tension, not harmony. After finishing at Schulpfurte, Nietzsche entered the University of Bonn to study theology and philology, the study of ancient languages. At first, he intended to follow in his father's footsteps, but theology soon disillusioned him. He found the lectures dry, the faith dogmatic, the answers too neat. In a letter to his sister, he confessed that he could no longer believe in the Christian God. "If you wish peace of soul and happiness," he wrote, "then believe. If you wish to be a disciple of truth, then inquire." He chose inquiry. At Bonn, Nietzsche discovered the work of Arthur Schopenhauer, a philosopher whose dark vision of existence struck him like revelation. Schopenhauer taught that life was driven by blind, insatiable desire, a will that condemned humans to perpetual suffering. The only redemption lay in renunciation, in denying the will through art and asceticism. Nietzsche admired Schopenhauer's courage to face despair without illusion. Here, finally, was a philosopher who spoke honestly of life's cruelty. But Nietzsche would not remain a disciple for long. Even then, his instinct was not to follow, but to fight. After a year, he transferred to Leipzig, where he studied under Friedrich, a renowned philologist. There, amid endless manuscripts and dusty libraries, Nietzsche's genius began to shine. His essays on Greek tragedy revealed a mind capable not only of analysis, but of vision. When he was just 24, he was offered a professorship at the University of Basel, an almost unheard of honor for someone so young. He hadn't even completed his doctorate. In 1869, he crossed the border into Switzerland to begin what should have been a brilliant academic career. At Basel, Nietzsche lectured on ancient Greek literature and philosophy, but he found himself drawn to deeper questions. How had the Greeks, with their tragic worldview, created such radiant culture? How had they transformed suffering into beauty? His reflections would culminate in his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, a daring blend of philology, philosophy, and art. In it, Nietzsche proposed that Greek tragedy arose from the fusion of two forces, the Apollonian, order, reason, form, and the Dionysian, chaos, passion, ecstasy. Tragedy, he said, was not despairing but celebratory. It revealed that life, though cruel, was still worth affirming. The book shocked the academic world. It defied the sober style of scholarship and spoke instead in the voice of a visionary. Critics dismissed it as wild and unscientific. Nietzsche's colleagues turned against him. His reputation as a scholar collapsed almost as soon as it had begun. Yet The Birth of Tragedy was the seed of everything that would follow. It announced Nietzsche's lifelong theme, the reconciliation of life's beauty and terror. He began to withdraw from the university, disillusioned by academic pettiness. He found solace in friendship, most notably with Richard Wagner, the composer whose music electrified Europe. To Nietzsche, Wagner seemed the living embodiment of the Dionysian spirit, bold, passionate, transformative. Wagner, in turn, admired the young philosopher's brilliance and introduced him to his circle of artists and thinkers. For a few years, Nietzsche was enchanted. He saw in Wagner's art the rebirth of Greek tragedy, a union of music, myth, and philosophy. He visited Wagner's home, spent evenings discussing art and destiny, and even called him a modern hero. But the friendship would not last. Wagner's turn toward nationalism and Christianity repelled Nietzsche. The man he once revered as a cultural liberator began to seem like a preacher in disguise. Nietzsche felt betrayed, not only by Wagner, but by the very culture he represented. He began to write with new fury, attacking the moral and religious complacency of modern Europe. Illness soon joined disillusionment. Nietzsche's health had always been fragile. He suffered from migraines so violent they left him blind for days, from digestive troubles that made eating painful, from insomnia and exhaustion. His body became an instrument of torment. By 1879, he was forced to resign his professorship. He was only 34. What followed was a decade of wandering. Without steady income, often living in rented rooms across Switzerland, Italy, and southern France, Nietzsche wrote in solitude. His books, Human, All Too Human, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, The Gay Science, On the Genealogy of Morality, poured out in feverish bursts of insight. He had no school, no disciples, no recognition. His works sold poorly, often fewer than 100 copies. Yet in those lonely years, he forged one of the most original bodies of thought in Western philosophy. Nietzsche lived as he wrote, without safety nets. He rejected pity, despised conformity, and embraced hardship as the price of creation. One must still have chaos in oneself, he wrote, to give birth to a dancing star. But even stars burn out. By the mid-1880s, his health worsened. His vision blurred. His headaches grew unbearable. His friendships collapsed one by one. His sister Elizabeth, once devoted, grew distant and manipulative. He lived almost entirely alone, sustained by letters and by his writing. Then, in January 1889, in the city of Turin, the final collapse came. Walking through a square, Nietzsche saw a horse being whipped by its driver. He rushed forward, threw his arms around the animal's neck, and wept. Moments later, he fell to the ground. He never recovered his sanity. He spent the remaining 11 years of his life in mental darkness, first in asylums, then under his mother's care, and finally under his sister's. The once luminous mind that had dissected God and morality now wandered in confusion. Yet his words remained. During his illness, his sister began collecting and publishing his writings, often distorting them for her own ideological ends. She reshaped his legacy, aligning him with nationalist and later proto-fascist ideals that Nietzsche himself would have despised. The real Nietzsche, the solitary thinker who fought against herd mentality and blind obedience, was buried beneath propaganda and myth. It would take decades for scholars to recover the true voice behind the distortions. That voice, however, still speaks, fierce, wounded, and luminous. Nietzsche's life was a tragedy in the classical sense, the story of a man destroyed by the very fire that made him great. He sought truth so relentlessly that it burned through his body and mind. Yet even in ruin, he fulfilled his own command. He lived dangerously, and he lived honestly. When he died in 1900, the new century he would never see was already trembling with his ideas. His words would shape the thoughts of poets and revolutionaries, psychologists and existentialists. His madness would become legend. His philosophy, a weapon and a warning. To understand Nietzsche's ideas, one must remember the man who bore them, a man who turned suffering into song, who looked into the abyss and refused to look away. The next step in our journey takes us to the heart of his most infamous declaration, one that shook not only theology, but the entire foundation of Western thought. It begins with 3 words, God is dead. When Nietzsche wrote the words, God is dead, he did not do so with triumph. There is no laughter in that sentence, no mockery of faith. It is not the cry of a rebel celebrating his victory over heaven. It is the sigh of a prophet who has seen what others refuse to see. The words first appeared in The Gay Science, published in 1882. There, Nietzsche told a strange parable, the story of a madman who runs into a marketplace at dawn, holding a lantern, shouting, "I seek God, I seek God." The crowd laughs. The believers and the skeptics alike mock him. Has he lost his way? They ask. Is he hiding? Then the madman stops, looks at them, and declares, God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. The crowd falls silent. It is one of the most haunting scenes in modern philosophy, a metaphor not for blasphemy, but for history itself. For Nietzsche, God was not simply the deity of Christianity. It was the symbol of everything absolute: truth, morality, order, meaning. It represented the foundation upon which Western civilization had built its identity. To say that God is dead was to say that those foundations had collapsed. The Enlightenment, science, rational inquiry, all had gradually eroded the soil of faith. People no longer believed because they could no longer afford to. The old moral certainties had lost their power. The heavens had gone silent, but the death of God was not a single event. It was a long decay, a slow unraveling that Nietzsche saw reaching its culmination in the modern world. For centuries, European thought had been chipping away at its own foundations, and now, finally, the building stood empty. Nietzsche saw it clearly. Humanity had outgrown its gods, but not yet learned to live without them. The old faiths had died, but their shadows still haunted the world, in moral codes, political ideologies, and scientific optimism. He called this condition nihilism, the recognition that life has no inherent meaning or purpose. It was not a philosophical position, but a sickness of civilization. For Nietzsche, nihilism was the greatest crisis ever to face humanity. If all values were human inventions, what could still guide us? If there was no divine order, no eternal truth, no cosmic justice, then what remained? He feared that in this vacuum, humanity would turn to substitutes: nationalism, materialism, conformity. People would cling to comfort, inventing new idols to replace the old, not gods in heaven, but gods in ideology, consumption, and routine. Nietzsche saw the modern world rushing toward that fate. He imagined a future where people would live safely, comfortably, without struggle or passion, where ambition and greatness would be replaced by entertainment and ease. He called this the age of the last men, small souls content with mediocrity, proud of their health and their gadgets, afraid of risk and depth. He wrote of them with pity and disgust. They have left the regions where it is hard to live, says Zarathustra, for they need warmth. One still loves one's neighbor and rubs against him, for one needs warmth. The last men laugh at the idea of greatness. They smile and say, "We have invented happiness." And in that smile, Nietzsche saw the death not only of God, but of spirit. The death of God, then, was not an event to celebrate. It was a catastrophe to overcome. It meant that the highest values of the past had lost their authority. The challenge now was to create new ones. This is why Nietzsche's philosophy is both diagnosis and cure. He describes the disease of nihilism, the collapse of faith, purpose, and truth, and then demands that humanity rise beyond it. "We must become gods ourselves," he wrote, "if we are to seem worthy of having killed God." It was not arrogance, but necessity. Without new values, life would sink into meaninglessness. The old morality, grounded in divine command, could no longer serve. A new morality, human, creative, life-affirming, had to be born. Nietzsche did not give easy instructions. He offered no new commandments. Instead, he pointed toward an ideal, the Vieux Mensch, the overman, as the figure who would overcome nihilism by creating meaning from within. The Vieux Mensch would not mourn the death of God. He would dance upon the grave of old certainties and begin anew. But such creation required a strength few possessed. Most would fall into despair or apathy. The modern world, Nietzsche believed, was not yet ready for the freedom it had claimed. People still wanted comfort, not creation, security, not risk. They would continue to speak of morality, even after its source had vanished. They would live in the ruins of belief without realizing that the temple was empty. This hypocrisy enraged Nietzsche. He despised what he called the moral hangover of Christianity, the way society preserved Christian values like compassion, humility, and guilt even after abandoning belief in God. "When one gives up the Christian faith," he wrote, "one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet." He saw this as a fundamental dishonesty, a refusal to face the full consequences of unbelief. If God was dead, then all values must be re-examined. No truth was sacred, no ideal unquestionable. Everything had to be revalued from the ground up. This project, the revaluation of all values, became the central task of his philosophy. It was not destruction for its own sake, but the clearing of ground for something new. Nietzsche believed that only through destruction could creation be reborn. You must have chaos within you, he wrote, to give birth to a dancing star. In this sense, the death of God was not an ending but an opportunity. It was humanity's great test. Could we bear the weight of freedom? Could we create meaning where none was given? Could we affirm life without illusions? Nietzsche's answer was yes, but only for the few who dared. To face the abyss without flinching, to love fate without hope of redemption, to create beauty in the midst of suffering. This, for Nietzsche, was the highest form of courage. He was not preaching atheism. He was preaching transformation. He did not want to destroy faith. He wanted to awaken strength. His cry that God is dead was not an attack on religion, but a summons to greatness. In the modern age, Nietzsche's insight has become eerily prophetic. The world is more secular than ever, yet the hunger for meaning remains. People chase transcendence in politics, in art, in identity, in technology. The gods may be gone, but their absence still shapes us. Every ideology that promises salvation, every leader who claims absolute truth, every consumer culture that offers endless distraction, all are symptoms of the same longing. Humanity cannot live without meaning. And in the silence left by God's death, it invents new faiths again and again. Nietzsche's warning was clear. If we do not create meaning consciously, it will be created for us by those who understand power better than truth. His words echo in the modern world, in the emptiness of social media validation, in the fatigue of constant progress, in the quiet despair beneath abundance. The death of God is not a moment in history. It is an ongoing condition. Nietzsche saw this coming not with pride, but with pity. The madman in his parable ends his speech in anguish. What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we need to invent? He cries, must we ourselves not become gods, simply to appear worthy of it? The crowd, unable to understand him, looks on in confusion. The madman smashes his lantern and says, I have come too early. My time is not yet. He was right. Nietzsche's time had not yet come, but it would. The 20th century would be marked by the very crisis he foretold. Wars of ideology, the rise and fall of totalitarian faiths, the disillusionment of progress, the loneliness of secularism. And yet, amid the ruins, his challenge remains: to become creators of value, not victims of meaninglessness. For Nietzsche, the death of God was the most honest moment in human history. It stripped away illusion and left us face to face with ourselves. In that nakedness lay both terror and possibility. To live after the death of God is to live without guarantees. It is to walk the tightrope of existence without a net, but also to see, for the first time, the full horizon of human potential. From this insight grew Nietzsche's next great concept, the force that drives all creation, ambition, and transformation. He called it the will to power. For Nietzsche, philosophy was never an abstract exercise. It was a pulse, something alive, dangerous, intoxicating. He did not want to explain the world. He wanted to set it on fire. After declaring that God is dead, Nietzsche faced the question that followed like a shadow. What now gives meaning to life? The answer, he believed, could not come from morality, religion, or reason alone. It had to come from something deeper, from life itself. He called this force the will to power. It is one of the most misunderstood ideas in modern thought. To many, it sounds like a call for domination, a philosophy for tyrants and conquerors. But Nietzsche meant something far more profound. The will to power is not the thirst for control over others. It is the inner drive that makes all living things reach beyond themselves. The impulse to grow, to create, to overcome. Every form of life, Nietzsche said, is an expression of this will. A tree stretching toward the sun, an artist shaping chaos into form, a thinker challenging the limits of knowledge, all are manifestations of the same fundamental energy. The desire not just to survive, but to thrive, to expand, to assert one's form upon the world. For Nietzsche, life itself is will to power. There is no separate essence, no divine plan, no hidden purpose behind existence. Life is the striving, the overcoming, the becoming. This vision stood in sharp contrast to the moral and religious systems that had defined Western thought for centuries. Christianity, he believed, had turned life against itself, teaching that humility was virtue, that weakness was moral, that desire was sin. It had glorified suffering, guilt, and obedience, what Nietzsche called the slave morality. Such morality, he argued, was born not from strength, but from resentment. The bitterness of those unable to express their power, who instead condemned the strong and praised submission as holiness. He traced this psychology through history. The weak, unable to act, redefine their weakness as virtue. The powerful, condemned for their vitality, begin to doubt themselves. Over time, life learns to hate itself. In Nietzsche's eyes, this was the deepest sickness of the human spirit, a moral inversion that turned strength into sin and vitality into vice. The will to power was his antidote. It was the call to affirm life again, not to justify it through religion or reason, but to embrace it as it is, fierce, chaotic, and creative. To will power meant to will transformation, to face suffering not as punishment, but as necessity, to see conflict not as tragedy, but as the engine of growth. What does not kill me, he wrote, makes me stronger. In that single sentence, the essence of his thought beats like a heart. Nietzsche saw existence as a constant struggle between forces, creation and decay, order and chaos, will and resistance. But this struggle was not a flaw to be overcome. It was life itself. To live is to strive. To cease striving is to die. This insight shaped everything Nietzsche wrote thereafter. His philosophy was not about peace, but about intensity. Not about comfort, but about depth. He wanted humanity to become what it truly was. Not a creature of fear and obedience, but of creation and courage. He saw two kinds of people in every age, those who affirm life and those who deny it. The affirmers, the creators, artists, warriors of spirit, say yes to existence in all its pain and beauty. The deniers, the resentful, the moralizers, hide from life, clinging to illusions of virtue and security. In the will to power, Nietzsche saw the measure of the soul. Those who embraced it became expansive, radiant, dangerous, like the great artists and heroes of history. Those who repressed it grew small, bitter, and vengeful. He admired figures like Goethe, Napoleon, and Beethoven, individuals who, in their own way, bent reality to their vision. They embodied what he called the aristocracy of spirit, not of birth or wealth, but of vitality. For Nietzsche, such figures proved that creation and destruction were inseparable. Every act of true creation destroys what came before. To bring something new into being, one must first clear the old, beliefs, habits, values. That is why he called the philosopher a dynamite. But this power was not about cruelty or conquest. Nietzsche was not advocating tyranny. He despised the state, nationalism, and herd movements of any kind. True power for him began within, the mastery of one's own instincts, fears, and desires. The highest form of power, he wrote, is self-overcoming. It is easy to dominate others. It is far harder to master oneself. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, his most poetic work, Nietzsche personified this journey in the figure of Zarathustra, a sage who descends from the mountains to teach humanity that life must be affirmed, not escaped. Zarathustra speaks of three transformations of the spirit. First, the camel, who bears heavy loads, accepting the weight of tradition and duty. Then the lion, who rebels, saying no to all masters, slaying the dragon of thou shalt. Finally, the child, who says yes, who creates, who plays, who begins anew. These stages mirror the journey of the will to power, from obedience to rebellion to creation. In the end, Nietzsche's vision was not destructive, but life-affirming. He wanted to awaken in humanity a deeper love of existence, what he called amor fati, the love of fate. To love fate is to say yes, not only to joy but to suffering, not only to success but to loss, to affirm every moment as necessary and beautiful. My formula for greatness in a human being, he wrote, is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. This was Nietzsche's response to nihilism. Against despair, he placed creation. Against meaninglessness, he placed affirmation. Against fear, he placed power, not the power to control others, but the power to become oneself. In this, the will to power was not a theory of politics, but a vision of life. It was the rhythm of existence, the pulse of evolution, the song of the strong soul that refuses to surrender. He saw in it the possibility of a new humanity, one no longer bound by guilt or submission, but free to create values from within. But Nietzsche also knew the danger. Power, once unleashed, could devour itself. The same force that drives creation could descend into destruction, into tyranny, into madness. The will to power could build, or it could burn. And Nietzsche's own life would come to reflect that tension all too clearly. As his mind began to fray, his thought grew darker, more intense. He saw visions of eternal recurrence, of a cosmos endlessly repeating itself. He imagined a world where every choice, every pain, every joy would return forever, and asked, could we still say yes? It was his final test of affirmation, and the final expression of the will to power. When Nietzsche spoke through Zarathustra, he was not simply writing a book, he was giving voice to a prophecy. In the ruins of old beliefs, amid the twilight of gods and morals, he saw the need for a new kind of being. Not a savior, not a saint, but a creator. He called this being the Bermensch, often translated as the Overman or Superman, though neither word quite captures the depth of the idea. The Bermensch was not a hero of brute strength or political power. He was not a conqueror of nations or a master of others. He was a conqueror of himself, a creator of new values, a reimaginer of existence. For Nietzsche, the death of God had left humanity suspended over an abyss. The old moral order had collapsed, but a new one had not yet been born. Without God, there were no divine commandments, no cosmic justice, no fixed purpose. Humanity faced the terrifying freedom of meaninglessness. What would we do with that freedom? Most, Nietzsche feared, would retreat into comfort. They would build soft lives, safe lives, avoiding pain, avoiding risk, a civilization of contentment without greatness. He called them the last men. The last man is satisfied, but empty. He has his pleasures, his security, his entertainment, but no purpose beyond comfort. He fears suffering more than he desires greatness. He confuses well-being with meaning, safety with virtue, longevity with life. The last man blinks and says, "We have invented happiness," while his soul withers quietly. Nietzsche saw the modern world marching toward this fate. Industrial progress, democracy, mass culture. To him, these were not signs of elevation, but of exhaustion. Civilization, he warned, was becoming too tame, too civilized. The instincts that once drove art, heroism, and creation were being smothered under mediocrity and convenience. Man is something that shall be overcome, Zarathustra declares. The Mensch is that overcoming, the next step in human evolution, not biological but spiritual. The Mensch is not bound by inherited morality. He does not seek approval or follow the crowd. He creates his own values, not out of whim, but out of necessity, as an artist creates beauty from chaos. Where the last man seeks comfort, the Mensch seeks challenge. Where the last man avoids pain, the Mensch transforms it. Where the last man obeys, the Mensch commands. First himself, then his world. The Mensch loves life not because it is easy, but because it is full of joy and suffering, of triumph and tragedy. He affirms existence even in its darkest moments. He says yes to all that is. This, for Nietzsche, was the highest form of strength, not domination, but affirmation. The weak spirit says no. No to pain, no to conflict, no to the unknown. The strong spirit says yes. Yes to the storm, yes to the struggle, yes to becoming. Nietzsche saw the Mensch not as a distant myth, but as a goal for humanity, a horizon toward which we must strive. He was the image of self-overcoming made flesh. To create him, we would need to unlearn the old habits of pity and guilt. We would need to accept that suffering is not evil, that struggle is not failure, that life's cruelty is also its beauty. Only then could we become strong enough to create new meaning. For Nietzsche, history was not progress, but cycles of rise and decay. Civilizations flourished when they affirmed life, when they celebrated strength, art, and passion. They declined when they turned against themselves, when morality replaced vitality, when the spirit grew tired. He saw Europe of his time as standing at the edge of that decline, rich, educated, but weary, full of knowledge, but lacking wisdom. It was a culture of last men, living comfortably, yet spiritually hollow. The Mensch was his answer, not as an ideal to worship, but as a challenge to embody. It was a call for a new kind of human being, one who could dance upon the edge of chaos without falling, who could say yes to existence without illusion. Nietzsche's vision was not political. He despised nationalism and the herd mentality of mass movements. He believed the Mensch would be rare, solitary, misunderstood, like the great artists and prophets before him. He would live dangerously, not because he craved risk, but because life itself demanded courage. Build your cities on the slopes of Vesuvius, Nietzsche wrote. Live dangerously. For him, danger was not recklessness, but vitality. The willingness to live without guarantees, to create without knowing the outcome. The Mensch embraces this danger as the condition of greatness. He does not seek certainty, because certainty is the death of growth. He does not crave eternal truths, because life itself is flux. He becomes a river, not a monument. In the figure of Zarathustra, Nietzsche expressed this new spirit in poetic form. Zarathustra descends from his solitude in the mountains to share his vision with mankind, but his words fall on deaf ears. The crowd laughs when he speaks of the Mensch. They say, "Give us the last man instead." It is one of the most haunting scenes in modern literature. Humanity, offered transcendence, chooses comfort. Offered meaning, it chooses pleasure. Offered greatness, it chooses safety. The tragedy of modernity, Nietzsche believed, was not that it had lost its faith in God, but that it had lost its taste for becoming godlike. Without the drive to overcome, to grow, to create, humanity would stagnate in mediocrity, intelligent, comfortable, and spiritually dead. Nietzsche did not believe everyone could become an Mensch. Most, he thought, would remain in the herd, content to follow, to conform, to survive. But the few who could rise above would give new direction to life itself. They would be the artists, the poets, the thinkers, the rebels, those who dared to invent values after the collapse of all absolutes. In their hands, meaning would be reborn. Nietzsche once wrote, "The secret for harvesting from existence, the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment is to live dangerously." The Mensch embodies that danger, not as chaos, but as creation. For him, every moment is an opportunity to say yes, to transform pain into power, loneliness into depth, and uncertainty into possibility. This was the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy: to become what you are, to say yes to life, even when it breaks you, to love your fate, and to create beyond it. The Mensch, then, is not a myth to worship, but a mirror to confront. He is the question Nietzsche left to all who came after. What will you make of your freedom, now that the gods are gone? And that question would echo through every page of his later work, leading him to one of his most profound and unsettling ideas. What if the life you live, every joy and every sorrow, must be lived again, endlessly, forever, without escape? It was the ultimate test of affirmation, and it would drive Nietzsche to the edge of both genius and madness. Among all the ideas Nietzsche explored, none is more haunting, more demanding, or more beautiful than the thought of eternal recurrence. It is not a doctrine, not a metaphysical claim, not even something to be believed. It is a test, the most terrifying test of all. Imagine Nietzsche wrote that one day a demon comes to you in the loneliest of nights and whispers, "This life as you now live it, and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. There will be nothing new in it, but every pain, every joy, every thought, and every sigh must return to you in the same succession and sequence, even this very moment and this very thought." How would you respond? Would you fall to the ground, cursing the demon, crying that such repetition would be unbearable? Or would you say, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? That reaction, Nietzsche said, would reveal the deepest truth about your life. For if you could affirm your existence so completely that you would will its repetition forever, not just its pleasures, but its sorrows, not just its triumphs, but its humiliations, then you would have achieved the highest form of love, amor fati, the love of fate. The thought of eternal recurrence began as a whisper in Nietzsche's notebooks, but it soon became the beating heart of his philosophy. It was not meant as a literal cosmology, though Nietzsche did speculate whether the universe might indeed repeat infinitely. Its real meaning was existential. It was a mirror held up to the soul. Could one live in such a way that every moment, if lived eternally, would still be worthy of being lived? The idea transforms every choice. Each decision, each word, each act becomes infinite, because to choose it once is to choose it forever. In this way, eternal recurrence strips away illusions. It forces us to face the weight of our existence. No escape, no second chances, no cosmic redemption, only the eternal return of what is. For Nietzsche, this was not a punishment, but the ultimate challenge. It demanded that we become artists of life, shaping each moment into something beautiful enough to bear eternal repetition. The thought of eternal recurrence is not meant to be comforting. It is a crucible. It burns away weakness, self-deception, and regret, leaving only affirmation or despair. It is, in Nietzsche's words, the heaviest of burdens. And yet, he also called it the greatest gift. For those who can bear it, eternal recurrence transforms time into eternity, not in the religious sense of an afterlife, but in the sense that every instant becomes absolute. Every moment, fully lived, contains all existence. This is what Nietzsche meant by amor fati, the love of one's fate, not because it is perfect, but because it is ours. To affirm life in its totality, the joy and the suffering, the beauty and the horror, is to become free from resentment, from guilt, from the longing for another world. It is to say, yes, even to pain. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche describes the moment when Zarathustra is confronted by the eternal recurrence. He recoils at first. The idea is unbearable. But then he begins to laugh. He laughs because he sees that the burden of recurrence is also its liberation. If all returns, then nothing is lost. If all repeats, then every sorrow is also eternal joy. If every moment is fated, then there is nothing left to regret, only to affirm. It is one of the most paradoxical insights in all philosophy, that the deepest freedom lies in the acceptance of necessity. By embracing what cannot be changed, one becomes master of one's fate. Nietzsche's idea anticipates the modern quest for meaning in a world without transcendence. It is not unlike the mindfulness of the East, the awareness that every moment, fully lived, contains eternity. But where Buddhism seeks release from the cycle of rebirth, Nietzsche seeks affirmation of it. Where others seek escape from suffering, he seeks to transform it into strength. To live as if one must repeat life forever is to live deliberately, courageously, passionately. It is to recognize that every act echoes across eternity. Nietzsche's thought challenges not only individuals, but entire cultures. If a civilization had to relive its history endlessly, what values would it choose? Would it still build its empires, wage its wars, consume and forget? Or would it learn to create in a way that could be loved eternally? In this sense, eternal recurrence is both personal and cosmic, a demand for responsibility, for artistry, for love. It is the ethical center of Nietzsche's philosophy, hidden within its poetry. To the weak, it is unbearable. To the strong, it is divine. In his notebooks, Nietzsche wrote, "My greatest thought." He considered eternal recurrence the ultimate measure of affirmation, a thought that could either crush or liberate the soul. To those who cannot love life, the thought is despair. To those who can, it is salvation. Nietzsche himself wrestled with it for years. His health deteriorated, his isolation deepened, yet his writing grew ever more luminous. In the face of suffering, he sought not escape but transformation, to turn pain into creation, darkness into fire. In that sense, the eternal recurrence was not just an idea, but a way of living. Each morning, each word, each breath was a test. Could he affirm it, knowing it might return forever? This question would haunt him to the end. And as his mind began to unravel, it was as if the thought he had given to the world, the circle of eternal return, had turned back upon him. He had demanded of life that it justify itself eternally. Now life demanded the same of him. Soon, Nietzsche would turn his gaze toward morality itself, the system of values that had governed humanity for 2,000 years. If life is to be affirmed eternally, he would ask, then what kind of morality is worthy of that affirmation? What kind of truth can survive the eternal return? To answer that, Nietzsche would have to strike at the deepest roots of Western civilization, at its faith in good and evil, its worship of truth, its belief in reason itself. What followed would make him one of the most feared and misunderstood thinkers in history. For centuries, Western civilization had lived under the long shadow of moral certainty. From Moses to Plato, from Augustine to Kant, the great systems of thought had sought to anchor human life in fixed ideals, in eternal truths, divine laws, and universal reason. To Nietzsche, this was the most subtle and suffocating of prisons. He saw in it not wisdom, but fear, a fear of chaos, of instinct, of life itself. Behind every moral code, he said, lies a psychology, the hidden desires, resentments, and weaknesses of those who invent it. Every morality, Nietzsche wrote, is a piece of tyranny against nature. It was a dangerous claim, and it made Nietzsche himself a dangerous man. He did not come to destroy morality out of nihilism, but out of love for life. He believed that morality, as it had developed in the West, had become a denial of life's vitality, a system designed to protect the weak by condemning the strong. He called this the slave morality. In ancient societies, he observed, strength, courage, and excellence were celebrated as virtues. The noble, the warrior, the creator, these were the highest types of man. Their morality was born from abundance, from the joy of power, from the affirmation of life. This was what Nietzsche called the master morality. But over time, those who were weaker, the oppressed, the powerless, the fearful, began to reinterpret morality in their own favor. Unable to express power directly, they expressed it through negation, by condemning strength as evil, pride as sin, passion as vice. They called their weakness goodness, their submission virtue, their impotence humility. Thus was born the morality of resentment. Resentment, as Nietzsche called it, the morality of the slave. Christianity, in his view, was its most sophisticated expression. It transformed the suffering of the weak into a weapon against the strong. It preached love, but beneath its love was resentment. It taught forgiveness, but beneath its forgiveness was revenge. It promised heaven only by condemning the earth. The Christian, Nietzsche wrote, is the metaphysician of revenge. To Nietzsche, this was not a critique of individuals, but of an entire moral system, one that had turned life itself into guilt. Sin, he said, was the greatest invention of the weak, a way to make the strong feel ashamed of their power, to chain vitality with conscience. He saw in the cross not redemption, but the triumph of weakness, the victory of resentment disguised as holiness. And yet, Nietzsche did not call for cruelty or domination. His aim was not to replace one tyranny with another, but to free life from the need for tyranny altogether. He wanted to move beyond good and evil. The phrase did not mean moral indifference, but moral creation. He believed that values were not discovered but made, expressions of the will to power. Each age, each culture, each individual creates values that serve its form of life. To move beyond good and evil was to recognize this, to see morality not as a divine revelation, but as a human art. The noble spirit, Nietzsche said, creates values as an artist creates form, out of instinct, out of abundance, out of joy. The decadent spirit, by contrast, denies life and seeks refuge in fixed truths. This is why Nietzsche's philosophy was so dangerous. It undermined the very foundations of truth itself. For Nietzsche, there are no eternal truths, only perspectives. All things are subject to interpretation. He wrote, whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power, not truth. Truth, in other words, is not a mirror of reality, but a creation of the human will. What we call truth is simply the interpretation that has won, the story that has become dominant. This idea, perspectivism, shattered centuries of philosophical certainty. It meant that there is no objective standpoint outside life from which to judge it. All seeing is seen from somewhere. All knowledge is human. All thought is interpretation. Even science, Nietzsche argued, rests on faith. Faith in reason, in consistency, in logic. And that faith, too, is a will to power, the desire to impose order on chaos. For Nietzsche, this recognition did not lead to despair, but to liberation. If truth is a creation, then we are its creators. If values are made, then we can make them anew. But such freedom comes with danger. Without the security of fixed truths, most people would rather cling to illusions than face the terror of creation. That is why Nietzsche said, there are no facts, only interpretations, not to destroy truth, but to remind us that every truth is born of struggle. He saw philosophers not as passive observers, but as warriors of interpretation, those who shape the future by shaping what is believed. Every great epic, he thought, begins when a new kind of spirit arises, one strong enough to create values without hiding behind divine authority. That, for Nietzsche, was the task of the free spirit, the thinker who dares to see beyond inherited categories, who lives without certainty, and who loves life enough to risk everything for it. But such freedom is rare and dangerous. Most cannot bear it. They need comfort, belonging, obedience, the warmth of the herd. Nietzsche knew this, and he knew the price is speaking against it. He once said that philosophers must be willing to live and die for their truths, even if it means being misunderstood, hated, or forgotten. In his time, he was all three. His books were dismissed as madness, his ideas ignored or distorted, yet he foresaw it all. "I am not a man," he wrote, "I am dynamite." And he was right. For when Nietzsche questioned morality, he was not simply questioning ethics. He was questioning the architecture of meaning itself. He showed that our deepest convictions about truth, virtue, and reason were not eternal, but contingent, born of struggle and power. And he left humanity standing on a precipice. Without God, without absolute truth, without universal morality, what remains? To Nietzsche, that emptiness was not a void to fear, but a space to fill. It was an opening, terrifying and magnificent, through which the new human could emerge. The Bermensch, the creator of values, must step into that space. He must face the abyss and will meaning where there is none. That is what it means to be dangerous, to live without the protection of illusions and still say yes to life. Nietzsche's thought, like fire, both illuminates and burns. It frees us from falsehood, but it leaves us exposed to the storm. And few have had the courage to follow it to the end. Among those who did, or thought they did, were the philosophers who came after him. Some would build upon his ruins. Others would misread him entirely. But all would feel his presence, as if the century that followed was unfolding in his shadow. Imagine standing in the middle of a grand arena, watching a fierce debate unfold, a clash of minds that shaped the very foundation of Western philosophy. On one side, the ancient giants. Plato, whose ideas about perfect forms and eternal truths laid the groundwork for centuries of thought. On the other, Immanuel Kant, the Enlightenment thinker who emphasized reason, morality, and the categorical imperative. And Hegel, the master of dialectics, who believed history was an unfolding story heading toward absolute knowledge. On the opposite side stands Friedrich Nietzsche, the rebellious outsider who challenged and dismantled all these edifices. Today, we're diving deep into the epic battles between Nietzsche and these towering figures, exploring how his ideas not only challenged their philosophies, but also reshaped modern thought. Let's start with Plato, a philosopher who, over 2 millennia ago, proposed that beyond the physical world lies a realm of perfect, unchanging ideas. For Plato, this realm of forms was the ultimate reality, the blueprint behind everything we see, touch, and experience. When we see a beautiful sunset, it's just a shadow or copy of the perfect form of beauty. This idea profoundly influenced Western thought, establishing a hierarchy of knowledge and truth rooted in the eternal. Plato's allegory of the cave illustrates his worldview. Most people are prisoners chained in darkness, mistaking shadows on the wall for reality. Only philosophers, who seek higher knowledge, can escape and perceive the forms directly. This dualism between the material and the ideal has shaped religious doctrines, scientific pursuits, and philosophical debates for centuries. Enter Nietzsche. He looked at Plato's world of forms and saw it as a prison, a way to escape the chaos, passion, and vitality of life. For Nietzsche, the pursuit of absolute, unchanging truths was an illusion, a way for philosophers and priests to control and suppress human instincts. He argued that life is messy, unpredictable, and driven by the will to power, the fundamental force that compels us to grow, dominate, and affirm ourselves. Nietzsche's famous declaration that God is dead signals his rejection of the notion of eternal divine truths. Instead, he championed the idea that humans must create their own values in a universe devoid of inherent meaning. The idealist pursuit of perfect forms becomes a symbol of escapism, a denial of life's impermanence and chaos. Next, consider Immanuel Kant, the towering figure of the Enlightenment. Kant sought to establish a foundation for morality based on reason and universality. His categorical imperative, act only according to principles that could be universally applied, aimed to create a moral law rooted in rationality, not tradition or religion. Kant believed that human beings possess innate dignity because they are rational agents capable of autonomous moral judgment. His ethics emphasized duty, rational consistency, and moral law as something discoverable through reason. For Kant, morality was objective and universal. Everyone, regardless of culture or circumstance, should follow the same moral principles. Nietzsche, however, saw Kant's moral system as another form of dogma, an attempt to impose rational rules on the chaotic, instinctual nature of human life. He argued that morality, especially the Christian-influenced morality Kant often upheld, suppressed our vital instincts and natural drives. Nietzsche believed that morality is a human construct, often used by the powerful to control others, and that true strength lies in embracing our passions and instincts. He criticized moral systems based on duty and universality as life-denying, advocating instead for a master morality that celebrates strength, vitality, and individual excellence. Nietzsche's idea of the will to power stands opposed to Kant's emphasis on rational duty. It's about asserting oneself, creating values, and affirming life even in the face of chaos. Now, let's examine Hegel, the philosopher who viewed history as a rational process unfolding toward absolute knowledge. His dialectic thesis, antithesis, synthesis describes how ideas develop through conflict, leading to higher levels of understanding. For Hegel, history was the realization of human freedom and reason, moving toward an ultimate spirit or idea that would reconcile all contradictions. Hegel's philosophy is a grand and all-encompassing system that seeks to explain reality as a rational process. His view implies progress, evolution, and the idea that history has a purpose. Nietzsche, however, saw Hegel's dialectic as a treadmill, an endless chase after an ideal that never fully materializes. He rejected the notion that history moves toward a perfect state of harmony or enlightenment. Instead, Nietzsche believed history is a battleground of conflicting wills, power struggles, and chaos. The idea of progress, for Nietzsche, is a comforting myth, an illusion that distracts us from the reality of life's chaos. He introduced the concept of the death of God and the decline of absolute values, leading to a world where traditional moral and metaphysical certainties collapse. Nietzsche's critique of Hegel is rooted in his emphasis on life affirmation rather than rational reconciliation. These foundational disagreements are not just academic, they influence how we see ourselves and our societies today. The Platonic idealism persists in religious and philosophical doctrines that emphasize absolute truths. Kant's moral philosophy underpins modern notions of human rights and universal ethics, even as critics argue it can be rigid and detached from human passions. Hegel's dialectic has influenced historical materialism, Marxism, and theories of societal development. Yet Nietzsche's rebellion against these systems, his emphasis on individual strength, the will to power, and the rejection of absolute truths continues to resonate. In contemporary culture, these clashes manifest in debates over morality, truth, and the nature of progress. Is life about seeking eternal ideals, or about creating our own values amid chaos? Is history a rational unfolding, or a series of power struggles? Nietzsche's provocative stance challenges us to confront these questions directly. In the end, Nietzsche's confrontation with the giants of philosophy was not just a critique, but a revolution. He questioned the very foundations of Western thought, pushing us to reconsider the nature of truth, morality, and history. While Plato, Kant, and Hegel sought to find order and meaning in the universe, Nietzsche tore down those illusions, urging us to embrace life's chaos, craft our own values, and become creators of meaning. His ideas continue to inspire rebels, artists, philosophers, and thinkers who refuse to accept easy answers. The clash of ideas that once played out on the grandest stage still echoes today, reminding us that the most profound truths often lie beyond dogma, in the chaos of human existence. Throughout history, philosophers have engaged in intense debates about the nature of reality, knowledge, morality, and existence itself. These debates have often been marked by fundamental disagreements that shape entire eras of thought, influencing not only academic discourse, but also cultural, political, and spiritual life. Among the most significant and provocative of these disagreements is the clash between Friedrich Nietzsche and the great philosophers who preceded him, figures like Plato, Kant, and Hegel. Nietzsche's radical critiques and revolutionary ideas challenged the very foundations upon which these thinkers built their systems. To understand this intellectual confrontation is to engage with a series of profound questions. What is the nature of truth? What is the basis of morality? Is history a rational process or a chaotic struggle? And how do these questions influence the way we see ourselves and our world? Let us begin by examining the philosophical universe shaped by Plato, a universe grounded in the belief in eternal, unchangeable truths. Plato's theory of forms posits that behind the transient, imperfect physical world lies a realm of perfect, immutable ideas. For Plato, everything in the material world is a shadow or copy of these perfect forms, be it beauty, justice, or goodness. The physical world is thus a reflection of a higher reality, accessible only through reason and philosophical insight. This dualistic conception has profound implications. It elevates the realm of ideas above the material, establishing a hierarchy that has influenced religious doctrines, metaphysical speculation, and scientific inquiry for centuries. Plato's allegory of the cave vividly illustrates his worldview. Most people are prisoners chained in darkness, mistaking mere shadows cast on the wall for reality. Only philosophers who seek higher knowledge can break free from these chains and perceive the true forms directly. This ascent from ignorance to knowledge reflects a belief that truth is objective, eternal, and accessible through rational effort. In this worldview, the philosopher is the enlightened figure who understands the ultimate reality beyond the fleeting world of appearances. Enter Friedrich Nietzsche, who viewed Plato's idealism as a form of escapism, a way to detach from the messy, passionate reality of life. Nietzsche challenged the very notion of eternal, unchanging truths, arguing that such ideas are illusions that serve to suppress human instincts and vitality. For Nietzsche, life is inherently chaotic, unpredictable, and driven by the will to power, the fundamental force that compels us to grow, dominate, and affirm ourselves. The pursuit of absolute truth, in his eyes, is a form of nihilism, a denial of life's impermanence and flux. Nietzsche's famous declaration that God is dead encapsulates his rejection of the idea that there are divine or absolute truths governing the universe. Instead, he advocates for a radical reevaluation of values, an acknowledgement that meaning is not given but created. He urges individuals to embrace life's chaos, to forge their own values in a universe devoid of inherent purpose. The Platonic ideal of perfect forms becomes, in Nietzsche's critique, a symbol of the human tendency to escape from life into illusions of permanence and certainty. This confrontation extends to morality as well. Kant, the central figure of the Enlightenment, sought to ground morality in reason and universal principles. His formulation of the categorical imperative, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time, well, that it should become a universal law, aimed to establish a rational foundation for ethical behavior. Kant emphasized autonomy, dignity, and moral duty, asserting that rational agents are capable of discerning and following moral laws that apply equally to all. For Kant, morality is objective and rooted in human rationality. He believed that moral law is something discoverable through reason, independent of personal desires or cultural influences. This moral universality was intended to uphold human dignity and promote social harmony. Kant's ethics have profoundly influenced modern ideas of human rights, justice, and moral responsibility. Nietzsche, however, viewed Kant's moral system as another form of dogma, an attempt to impose rational rules on the chaotic, instinctual core of human nature. Nietzsche argued that morality, especially the Christian-influenced morality that Kant often upheld, was life-denying, designed to suppress natural instincts for strength, vitality, and self-assertion. He believed that morality is a human construct, often wielded by the powerful to control others and maintain social order. In Nietzsche's view, the moral frameworks built on duty and universality are symptomatic of what he called slave morality, values that foster weakness, guilt, and conformity. Instead, he champions a master morality rooted in strength, vitality, and individual excellence. His concept of the will to power embodies the strive to assert oneself, to create values, and to affirm life even amid suffering and chaos. Nietzsche's critique of Kant's rational morality underscores his broader rejection of systems that deny human instincts and passions. Turning to Hegel, we confront a different kind of debate, one about history, progress, and the evolution of human consciousness. Hegel viewed history as a rational process driven by the unfolding of the absolute spirit. His dialectic thesis, antithesis, synthesis describes how conflicting ideas and forces develop through conflict, leading to higher levels of understanding and self-awareness. For Hegel, history is a purposeful progression, moving toward the realization of human freedom and the reconciliation of contradictions within divine rational order. Hegel's philosophy is an ambitious system that seeks to understand reality as a rational whole. He believed that through the dialectical process, humanity gradually comes to know itself and its purpose. This view implies that history has a direction and evolution toward enlightenment, freedom, and the eventual unity of spirit with nature. Nietzsche, however, saw Hegel's dialectic as an illusion, a treadmill of endless conflict with no ultimate resolution. He rejected the idea that history moves toward harmonious or divine end. Instead, Nietzsche perceived history as a battleground of conflicting wills, power struggles, and chaos. The idea of progress, for Nietzsche, is a comforting myth, a story we tell ourselves to give meaning to a universe that is fundamentally indifferent to human aspirations. Nietzsche's critique of Hegel culminates in his declaration that God is dead. With the decline of absolute values and the collapse of traditional metaphysical certainties, humanity faces the challenge of creating new meanings in a universe devoid of divine order. Nietzsche advocates for a life-affirming philosophy that embraces chaos, suffering, and the will to power, rather than seeking solace in grand narratives of progress and reconciliation. These disagreements are not merely academic, they shape our modern worldview. The Platonic idealism persists in religious doctrines and philosophical doctrines that emphasize eternal truths. Kant's moral philosophy underpins human rights and universal ethics, even as critics argue that it can be overly rigid or disconnected from human passions. Hegel's dialectic influences theories of historical development, dialectical materialism, and social progress, but Nietzsche's rebellion offers a stark alternative, an emphasis on individual strength, creativity, and the affirmation of life's chaos. In contemporary culture, these debates manifest in ongoing discussions about morality, truth, and the meaning of history. Are we moving toward some ultimate ideal? Or are we caught in an endless struggle of competing forces? Is life about striving for eternal truths, or about inventing our own meanings? Nietzsche's provocative stance challenges us to confront these questions head-on, rejecting easy answers and embracing the complexities and contradictions of human existence. In conclusion, Nietzsche's confrontation with the towering figures of philosophy was revolutionary. He questioned the very foundations of Western thought truth, morality, progress, and urged us to look beyond dogmatic systems. while Plato, Kant, and Hegel sought to establish order, certainty, and purpose. Nietzsche dismantled these illusions, advocating for a life-affirming philosophy rooted in chaos, creativity, and individual strength. His ideas continue to inspire those who refuse to accept simplistic answers: artists, rebels, thinkers, and explorers of the human condition. The clash of ideas that once played out on the grand philosophical stage still echoes today, reminding us that genuine insight often lies beyond the comfort of dogma and in the tumult of life itself. Nietzsche's challenge is not just an attack on previous systems, but an invitation to embrace the ambiguity, suffering, and vitality that define human existence, an enduring call to create meaning amid the chaos.